Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The transport ship, Orion's Whisper, slipped out of hyperspace with a low hum, its thrusters purring as it entered the orbit of Col 47. The colony loomed below, a sprawling settlement of low-slung buildings nestled into the red soil of the barren planet. From the viewports of the ship, the surface looked desolate, devoid of life. Still no signs of contact, Kyle Rivers muttered, glancing at the blinking console. The young pilot had been running scans for hours now, hoping for a spark of life, some signal from the colony. But there was nothing. It's like the whole place just a broken bar stopped. Captain Jack Monroe stood behind him, arms folded, eyes locked on the surface below. His grizzled face was as unreadable as ever, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. Prepare for landing, he said. We're going down there. Kyle hesitated, his hand hovering over the controls. You sure about this, Captain? I mean, if they haven't responded yet, maybe we should wait for a. We've waited long enough, Monroe cut him off. A week with no communication? That's not a glitch. That's a problem. His eyes met Kyle's. We're going in. Kyle swallowed hard, gave a quick nod, and began the descent. Behind them, the rest of the team was preparing for what they hoped would be a routine rescue mission, though they all knew better. No one said it out loud, but they'd all felt the growing sense of dread ever since the colony went dark. Dr. Alice Trent sat across from Lieutenant Marcus Kane in the briefing room, her face bathed in the cold glow of her data pad. A biologist by training, Alice had seen her share of strange life forms on the outer colonies, but something about this mission felt a broken bar off. She glanced up at Marcus, who was meticulously cleaning his pulse rifle for the third time. You don't think this is going to be just a tech failure, do you? Alice asked, breaking the silence. Marcus grunted, his sharp blue eyes never leaving the rifle. I've learned not to trust easy answers out here, especially not in places like this. Alice bit her lip. The last report from Col 47 was normal. They were studying some new species in the cave system nearby. Maybe something went wrong with the experiments, or maybe something went wrong with the people, Marcus replied, his tone flat. The ship jolted as it touched down on the surface. Monroe's voice crackled over the comms. Gear up. We're heading out. As they descended the ramp, the air was still, too still. The soft wind kicked up red dust, but there were no sounds of machinery, no hum of generators, no sign of life at all, just silence. Where is everyone? Sarah Lee, the team's engineer, asked, her voice low as she surveyed the empty streets. This place should be bustling. It's like just a broken bar disappeared, Marcus muttered, scanning the surroundings with the barrel of his rifle. Monroe led the group toward the central hub of the colony, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. The colony's main door stood ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. He pushed them open with the tip of his boot and stepped inside. The interior was worse. Tables overturned, tools scattered across the floor, half-eaten meals left to rot. It looked like people had left in a hurry without any sense of where they were going. The only thing missing was a broken bar, the people themselves. Alice knelt by one of the tables, her fingers running over strange markings etched into its surface. They weren't random, they looked almost like symbols, but nothing she recognized. These weren't here in the original designs, she said, frowning. Monroe moved closer, his eyes narrowing. What do you make of them? Could be part of the experiment, or a broken bar. She trailed off, unwilling to voice the darker thoughts swimming in her mind. We'll check the labs, Monroe said. Kane, you're with me. Alice, Sarah, you check the power core. Rivers, stay with the ship. They moved swiftly through the complex, their boots echoing in the eerie silence. Monroe and Kane led the way to the research labs, their flashlights cutting through the dim corridors. As they approached, the door to one of the labs slid open with a hiss, revealing a room in disarray. Monitors blinked with static, and a strange organic residue coated the walls. Jesus, Kane muttered, lowering his rifle slightly as he stepped inside. Monroe moved to one of the monitors, tapping the screen to bring up the last logs. The footage flickered, showing snippets of the researchers' final moments in the lab. They were running tests on something big, something moving. But then the footage cut off, replaced by a distorted image of the same symbols Alice had seen etched into the table. What the hell were they working on here? Monroe asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Meanwhile, Alice and Sarah had reached the power core. The machinery was still running, though inconsistently. Sparks occasionally crackled from loose wires, and the lights flickered overhead. Sarah crouched down to inspect the power grid. It's functional, but there's been interference from a broken bar something, she said. Look at these energy readings. It's like the whole system is being drained by an external source. Alice didn't respond. She was standing still, her head cocked to one side, as if listening to something. Did you hear that? She whispered, her eyes wide. Hear what? Sarah asked, looking up from the cables. The whispering, Alice said, her voice barely audible. It's a broken bar coming from the cave system. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, her heart pounding. I don't hear anything, Alice. But Alice wasn't listening anymore. She was staring toward the large windows that overlooked the nearby mountains, her mind clearly elsewhere. The team regrouped at the central hub, their faces etched with unease. Monroe took one look at Alice and knew something was wrong. What happened? He asked. Alice blinked, as if shaking herself out of a trance. There's something out there, Captain. In the caves. I'm not sure what, but I think the colony was studying it, and a broken bar. I think it's still out there. Monroe's jaw tightened. We need answers. Kane, you and I will check out the caves. I'm coming too, Alice said, her voice firmer now. Monroe hesitated. He didn't like taking unnecessary risks, but he could see the determination in her eyes. Fine. Sarah, stay here and monitor the core. If something happens, call us immediately. Kyle, you keep the ship ready for a quick evac. The cave entrance was wide, a gaping maw in the side of the mountain that seemed to swallow the light. As they entered, the air grew colder, and the whispering Alice had heard grew louder, echoing in the vast, dark expanse. What is that? Kane muttered, his hand gripping his rifle tighter. It's not wind, Alice replied, her voice shaking slightly. It's something, a broken bar alive. As they ventured deeper, they found more of the strange organic residue, thicker now, covering the walls like a sickly web. And then they saw vague shapes moving in the shadows. They were humanoid, but their forms were twisted, dark, almost fluid in the way they moved. Monroe raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. Stay sharp, he whispered. The creatures didn't attack. They merely watched from the darkness, their eyes as if they had eyes, never straying from the intruders. And the whispers grew louder, seeping into their minds like a creeping fog. Monroe felt a sharp pain in his head, a sudden pressure that made him stumble. Kane was muttering something under his breath, his eyes wide with fear. They're inside our heads, Alice whispered, clutching her temples. We need to get out of here, now. But before they could move, the creatures stepped forward, their forms solidifying in the dim light. They were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs elongated, their faces hidden behind black, featureless masks. The whispers grew louder still, an assault on their senses. Monroe fired his weapon, the sharp crack echoing through the cave, but the bullet passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. They're not real, Alice gasped, pulling Monroe back. They're in our minds. The creatures advanced, and Monroe felt the world tilt, his vision blurring as the whispers threatened to overwhelm him. They had to escape. He had to get out before their minds shattered completely. Monroe's mind was a fog, but Alice's voice broke through the haze, pulling him back from the edge of madness. The creatures were closing in, their long, dark forms gliding over the rocky floor without a sound. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, his grip tightening around his weapon. It was useless against Emma, he knew that now, but it was all he had. They needed to move. Back to the entrance, Alice urged, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. We have to get out of their range. Monroe nodded, though his legs felt heavy, like they were wading through quicksand. He grabbed Kane's arm, yanking him away from the advancing creatures. The lieutenant's eyes were wide with panic, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He muttered under his breath, incoherent, but Monroe didn't have time to listen. They had to go. The whispering was louder now, deafening, as if the cave itself were alive and speaking to them, drawing them deeper into its maw. Monroe could feel it pressing against his skull, like icy fingers digging into his brain. Each step felt harder than the last, but somehow, they made it to the cave's entrance. The light from outside was a faint beacon, a reminder that they weren't trapped yet. Not completely. As they stumbled into the open air, the whispers faded, replaced by the sound of the wind sweeping across the barren landscape. Monroe doubled over, gasping for breath, the pounding in his head finally beginning to ease. Kane dropped to his knees, his hand still clutching his rifle, his knuckles white. Alice was the only one standing, her face pale, but composed. "They didn't follow us," she said, glancing back at the cave. "Not all the way." Monroe straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow. "They don't need to, they've already got inside our heads." Kane let out a low, bitter laugh. "I thought I was losing my mind in there." "You were," Alice replied quietly. "We all were." They made their way back to the colony, their steps slow and deliberate. The sky above was a deep, dusky red, the twin suns dipping below the horizon. The colony was still as lifeless as they'd left it, the eerie quiet settling over them once more. But this time, it felt different. Now they know what lurked beyond the walls. Sarah was waiting for them at the central hub, her face pinched with worry. "What the hell happened?" "I heard gunfire." Monroe shook his head, not trusting himself to explain just yet. Alice spoke instead. "There's something in the caves, something a broken bar alien. I don't know if it's alive in the way we understand, but it can affect our minds. It's a broken bar whispering to us, trying to drive us mad." Sarah's eyes widened. "Whispering? I haven't heard anything." "You will," Kane interrupted, his voice grim. "Soon enough." Monroe stepped forward, taking charge. "We need to leave. Now." "Whatever happened to the colonists, whatever those things are, they're not going to stop until we're gone, or worse." "We can't just leave," Alice protested. "We need to understand what's happening here. There's something about this planet, about those creatures." Monroe cut her off with a sharp look. "The mission was to find out what happened to the colony. Now we know. They're gone, and we will be too if we don't get off this rock." Alice looked like she wanted to argue, but the fatigue in her eyes betrayed her. She knew he was right, even if she didn't want to admit it. Sarah was already moving toward the comms panel, preparing to send the distress signal for extraction, when her hand froze over the controls. She blinked, confused, and then turned to the others. "It's not working." "What do you mean it's not working?" Monroe asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I mean the signal's not getting through," Sarah said, her voice trembling now. "Something's interfering with the transmitter. I've been trying to boost the signal for the last hour, but a broken bar. It's like something is jamming us." Monroe's jaw tightened. "The creatures?" "Maybe," Alice said, biting her lip. "Or maybe it's the energy field around the cave system." "Whatever it is, we can't call for help." Kane stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "So we're trapped here?" "No," Monroe said, his voice firm. "We're not trapped. We just need to fix the comms." "Sarah, what are our options?" Sarah rubbed the back of her neck, thinking quickly. "We could try boosting the signal manually from the ship's system, but we'll need more power. The colony's core is fluctuating as something's draining it. If we can stabilize it, we might be able to get the signal out." "Fine. You and Alice work on that," Monroe said. "Kane, you're with me. We're going to check the perimeter, make sure those things aren't getting closer." Alice gave him a tight nod and moved with Sarah toward the power core, leaving Monroe and Kane alone in the quiet corridor. The two men walked the length of the colony in silence, their footsteps the only sound. The sun had set fully now, casting the world in darkness. Monroe's flashlight swept over the barren landscape, but there was no sign of movement. The creatures had retreated into the cave or maybe they were just waiting. "They're still out there," Kane said quietly. "I can feel them." Monroe didn't respond. He felt it too, the lingering presence of the whispers at the back of his mind, like a faint static that wouldn't quite go away. He just hoped Alice and Sarah could get the comms working before it got worse. They completed their sweep and returned to the central hub, where Alice and Sarah were hard at work. The room was filled with the low hum of machinery and the sharp scent of burning circuits as Sarah attempted to reroute the power to the ship's transmitter. "How's it coming?" Monroe asked. "Not good," Sarah said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There's too much interference. I've never seen anything like it. Whatever's draining the power, it's a broken bar intelligent. It's almost like it knows what we're trying to do and is actively working against us." "Keep trying," Monroe said. "We don't have a lot of time." Hours passed. The silence of the colony was oppressive, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, as if they were alive. Monroe paced the length of the room, his nerves fraying with each passing minute. Kane sat in the corner, his head resting in his hands, his mind clearly still wrestling with the effects of the whispers. Just as Monroe was about to suggest they try something more drastic, Sarah let out a triumphant shout. "Got it! I think we've got enough power to boost the signal." Alice immediately moved to the comms panel and initiated the transmission. "This is Dr. Alice Trent of the Orion's Whisper. We are stranded on Col 47. The colony has been abandoned, and unknown entities are present. We require immediate extraction." "Repeat, immediate extraction." For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice crackled over the comms. "Acknowledged, Orion's Whisper. Extraction team en route." ETA 12 hours. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Monroe felt the tension in his shoulders ease, though not completely. 12 hours was a long time to wait with those things lurking in the darkness. "We need to hunker down," Monroe said. "Make sure those things don't get anywhere near us until the extraction team arrives." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. They barricaded the entrances, rigged the perimeter with sensors and alarms, and took shifts watching for any sign of movement. But the creatures didn't come. The night stretched on, the whispers a constant, maddening hum in the background, but the creatures remained in the caves. Just as the sun began to rise, Monroe felt the first stirrings of something wrong. The whispers, which had been faint for the last few hours, suddenly spiked in intensity, as if they were growing desperate. He could hear them now, clearer than ever, calling his name, telling him to come closer, to let them in. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog, but it was no use. They were in his head, and no amount of willpower could keep them out. Kane was the first to break. With a strangled cry, he bolted for the door, his eyes wide with terror. Monroe lunged after him, tackling him to the ground just as he reached the threshold. "Don't!" Monroe shouted, pinning Kane to the floor. "They're in your head. You can fight this." Kane struggled beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I can't a broken bar. I can't a broken bar." "Yes, you can," Monroe said, his voice fierce. "You have to." Kane's struggles gradually subsided, and Monroe released him, pulling him back into the room. The whispers continued, relentless, but Monroe could see the faint lights of the extraction ship on the horizon. They just had to hold out a little longer. When the ship finally touched down, Monroe felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. The extraction team, heavily armed and wary, escorted them aboard without incident, and as the colony shrank in the viewport behind them, Monroe could almost believe they were safe. But as the ship lifted off, Alice caught Monroe's gaze. Her eyes were dark, haunted, and in them, Monroe saw the same fear that had gripped him ever since they entered that cave. The whispers were still there, and they always would be.